Before I begin, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy stories about finding your strength when you've been pushed too far. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt utterly betrayed by someone you loved. My story starts with a mother's love, a dream dress, and a cruelty so profound it nearly broke me. My future daughter-in-law, Chloe, marrying my only son, Mark, said I was too ugly to come to their wedding, after I'd spent my entire life savings on her perfect gown. But I wasn't just some old woman to be discarded. This is how I ensured they understood the true cost of their ugliness, not mine. The weight of my 62 years had settled mostly in my hands, I often thought, hands that had worked tirelessly, first to support a husband taken too soon, and then to raise Mark, my boy, my world. He was a good son, or so I believed with every fiber of my being. When he brought Chloe home, a whirlwind of bright smiles and expensive tastes, I'd welcomed her with an open heart. She was, after all, the woman Mark loved, and his happiness was the architect of my own peace. My savings weren't vast, they were the carefully hoarded fruits of decades of careful budgeting, of denying myself small comforts so Mark could have a better start, so I could have a cushion against the uncertainties of old age. A little terraced house, paid off through sheer grit, and that modest sum in the bank that was my kingdom. When Chloe found the dress, her voice had dripped with an almost reverent awe. It was a confection of lace and silk, breathtakingly beautiful, and with a price tag that made my breath catch in my throat. 5 figures. More than I'd ever spent on anything in my life, save the deposit on my home. Mark looked at me, his eyes pleading, reflecting Chloe's desperate longing. "Mom, it's her dream," he'd murmured, and in that moment, what was I to do? The bank teller, a kind young woman named Sarah like myself, had looked at me with a flicker of concern when I'd requested the withdrawal of nearly everything. "Are you sure, Mrs. Albright?" she'd asked gently. I'd smiled, a little shakily. "It's for my son's happiness." Chloe's gratitude had been effusive, a flurry of hugs and declarations of how I was the best mother-in-law ever. I treasured those words, foolishly, as it turned out. The wedding planning had then consumed them, a dizzying spiral of florists, caterers, and venue viewings from which I was increasingly, subtly, excluded. I'd attributed it to the rush, to their youth. Then came the fitting. Chloe stood on the pedestal, a vision in white, the dress shimmering under the salon lights. She did look stunning. I felt a swell of maternal pride, mixed with a pang for my depleted savings. "It's perfect, darling," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Chloe turned, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She exchanged a look with Mark, who suddenly found the pattern of the carpet intensely interesting. "Actually, Sarah," Chloe began, her tone casual, almost bored, as if discussing the weather, "Mark and I have been talking. And, well, we just think it would be better if you didn't come to the wedding." I blinked, the salon's opulent decor seeming to tilt. Surely, I'd misheard. "Not come?" I echoed, a laugh bubbling up, a laugh of sheer disbelief. "But, why?" Chloe sighed, a delicate, put-upon sound. "It's just your appearance, Sarah," she said, her gaze flicking over me, lingering on my comfortable, slightly old-fashioned dress, my grey-streaked hair, the lines etched by time and worry around my eyes. "It's not really going to fit the aesthetic we are going for. The photos, you know. We want everything to be perfect." She paused, then delivered the final, crushing blow with a small, apologetic moo that was more insulting than any shout. "You're too, well, frankly, you'd look ugly in the photos. It would just bring the whole tone down." Ugly. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The assistant, who had been fussing with the hem, froze, her eyes wide. Mark remained silent, his gaze still fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched. In that moment, The 5-figure sum I'd handed over felt like ashes in my mouth, the dream dress a shroud for my heart. The world narrowed to Chloe's perfectly made-up face, her casual cruelty, and the deafening silence of my son. The drive home was a blur. I remember the steering wheel feeling slick beneath my trembling hands, the familiar streets of my town appearing alien and hostile. Chloe's words, "too ugly," echoed in the small confines of my car, each repetition a fresh stab. Ugly. After a lifetime of trying to be good, to be kind, to be loving, this was my label, bestowed by the woman my son had chosen, the woman for whom I had sacrificed my security. I parked in front of my little house, the one I'd scrimped and saved for, the one where I'd rocked Mark to sleep as a baby, nursed him through fevers, celebrated his birthdays. It had always been a sanctuary, but now it felt like a cold, empty box. I sat in the dim light of the living room, the silence pressing in on me. Sleep was an elusive stranger that night, and for many nights after. When I did drift off, images of Chloe in that glittering dress, her lips curved in a disdainful smile, would jolt me awake, my heart pounding. My first coherent thought was that I needed to talk to Mark, alone. He would explain. He would fix this. He loved me. He wouldn't let this stand. It took 2 days of my calls going to voicemail before he finally picked up, his voice wary. "Mom? Is everything okay?" I asked him to come over, my voice carefully neutral, though inside a storm was raging. He arrived looking harried, avoiding my eyes, much like he had in the bridal salon. I sat him down at the kitchen table, the very table where he'd done his homework as a child, where we'd shared countless meals and conversations. "Mark," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts, "what Chloe said about the wedding, about me being ugly." He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on a crack in the linoleum. "Mom, Chloe didn't mean it like that," he mumbled, the classic, cowardly excuse. "She's just stressed, you know. The wedding, it's a lot of pressure. She wants everything to be perfect. I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "And my presence, the presence of your mother, would make it imperfect." He ran a hand through his hair. "Look, it's her day, Mom. Can't you just understand? Maybe you could get a makeover. Or we could take some nice photos with you separately, before or after." A makeover. As if a new hairstyle and some lipstick could cover the wound she'd inflicted, or his monumental betrayal. His words, his complete and utter failure to defend me, to stand up for the woman who had given him everything, were 1,000 times more painful than Chloe's initial cruelty. It was like watching the foundation of my life crumble into dust. Suddenly, memories, sharp and vivid, flooded my mind. Working 2 jobs after his father died, the exhaustion a constant companion, just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. Giving up the chance to go back to college myself, so he could attend the university he'd set his heart on. Selling my late husband's beloved classic car, a piece of my heart, to help him with a deposit for his first apartment, the one he now shared with Chloe. Each sacrifice, made with love, now felt like a stone weighing me down, pulling me under. I saw Chloe then, not as a stressed bride, but as a calculating, manipulative woman who had systematically alienated Mark from me, who saw me not as family, but as a resource to be tapped and then discarded. And Mark. Mark was weak, easily led, blinded by her superficial charm, willing to trade his mother's dignity for a perfect aesthetic. I felt an isolation so profound it was a physical ache. The wedding plans, I knew, were barreling ahead, financed by my life savings, and I was to be erased from the picture, literally. Was my entire life's work as a mother meaningless? I whispered, more to myself than to him. He had no answer, just stared miserably at the floor, a stranger in my son's body. The days that followed were shrouded in a thick fog of grief. I mourned. I mourned the son I thought I knew, the loving boy who would hug me tightly and tell me I was the best mom in the world. I mourned the dream of a happy, extended family, of future grandchildren I might now never truly know. I mourned the loss of my own naive trust. The physical toll was undeniable. Food tasted like cardboard, sleep offered no respite, and a leaden weariness clung to me. My small house felt like a mausoleum, each photograph of a smiling mark of fresh torment. Yet, amidst the sorrow, a different emotion began to stir, a slow, simmering ember of anger. It wasn't a fiery, explosive rage, but a cold, hard knot forming in the pit of my stomach. The turning point, the moment that ember truly caught flame, wasn't dramatic. It was insidious. Mark had started sending perfunctory texts, "Hope you're okay, Mom," devoid of any real concern or apology. Then, one afternoon, about 2 weeks after the devastating pronouncement in the bridal salon, he called. His tone was breezy, almost cheerful. "Hey Mom, Chloe was just wondering if you still had that old recipe for your lemon drizzle cake. She thought it might be nice for one of the pre-wedding brunches some of her aunts are throwing." The casual audacity of it stole my breath. Here I was, uninvited to their wedding because I was deemed too ugly, yet my recipes were apparently still aesthetically pleasing enough for their celebrations. The sheer, unadulterated nerve. "No, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued it for weeks. "I don't seem to have it anymore." There was a pause. "Oh," he said, sounding vaguely surprised, perhaps even a little put out. "Okay. Well, Chloe also wanted to know if you'd, gotten over being upset about the wedding thing yet. She said it's really awkward for her, gotten over it. As if my profound hurt and humiliation were a common cold I should have recovered from by now. That was it. The last straw. In that instant, something inside me shifted, solidified. The tears that had been my constant companions dried up. The grief remained, a dull ache in the background, but overriding it now was a steely resolve. They thought I was a weak, old woman, easily dismissed, easily forgotten once my utility had expired. They had mistaken my lifelong kindness for inherent frailty, my maternal sacrifices for an endless well of meek compliance. They were about to discover how wrong they were. My initial thoughts weren't of revenge, not in the traditional, destructive sense. They were about reclaiming my dignity, about ensuring they understood the gravity of their actions. The money for the dress, my life savings, became a focal point. It was tangible, a symbol of their callous greed and my foolish generosity. I started to think. Really think. 4 years, I had put their needs, Mark's needs, before my own. Now, it was time to put myself first. I realized, with a startling clarity, that their underestimation of me could be my greatest weapon. They wouldn't expect me to fight back. They saw me as old, irrelevant, ugly. They wouldn't see the intelligent, capable woman beneath the grieving mother. My first small act of defiance, after refusing the recipe, was to block Mark's number for a few days. I needed space, silence, to let this new resolve take root. Then, I went to my old writing desk, pulled out my bank statements, and began to look up information online, not about lemon drizzle cake, but about the legal standing of gifts given under what felt like deeply false pretenses. A tiny spark of empowerment flickered to life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I was no longer just a victim of their cruelty. I was becoming the architect of my own response. The first person I confided in was Eleanor, my dearest friend. We'd known each other for over 40 years, through widowhood, through raising our children, through all the small joys and large sorrows that life had thrown our way. She lived just a few streets over, and her small, cluttered kitchen had always been a haven of good sense and strong tea. I called her, my voice still a little shaky, and asked if I could come over. When I sat at her familiar pine table, the story tumbled out: the dress, the money, Chloe's brutal words, Mark's devastating complicity. Eleanor listened, her usually cheerful face growing sterner with each detail. By the time I finished, her teacup was rattling in its saucer, her eyes blazing with an indignation that mirrored the slow burn in my own chest. "The unmitigated gall," she exclaimed, slamming her hand on the table, making the sugar bowl jump. "Sarah, that girl is a viper, and Mark, well, Mark needs a rude awakening. You can't let them do this to you. You've given that boy everything." Her outrage was a balm to my wounded spirit. It validated my pain, my anger, and more importantly, it affirmed the nascent resolve that was solidifying within me. "But what can I do, Eleanor?" I asked, the old feelings of helplessness trying to creep back in. "They hold all the cards. The wedding is happening. The money is spent," Eleanor snorted. "Nonsense. You hold the card of truth, Sarah. And dignity. And," she added, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully, "you might hold more practical cards than you think. That money for the dress, that wasn't just a gift, was it? It was given with the understanding that you would be a cherished part of their day." She was right. The implicit promise had been there, in Chloe's saccharine declarations of me being the best mother-in-law ever. Eleanor, ever practical, was the one who first suggested a lawyer. "You need to know your rights, Sarah. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore, this is about a significant financial sum, and frankly, about fraud. Emotional fraud, if nothing else." The idea of involving lawyers felt daunting, aggressive. It wasn't my way. But Eleanor was insistent. "Sometimes, dear, you have to fight fire with fire, or at least with a well-drafted legal letter." She even helped me find one, recommending a solicitor her late husband had used, a firm known for being discreet but tenacious. The name on the brass plaque read Thompson and Associates, but the specific lawyer Eleanor had mentioned was a Ms. Monica Holloway. I made the appointment with a trembling hand, feeling as though I were stepping into an entirely new and uncomfortable skin. Walking into Monica Holloway's office a few days later was like entering a different world. It was calm, professional, and exuded an air of quiet competence. Monica herself was younger than I expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a manner that was both empathetic and no-nonsense. I found myself recounting the whole sordid tale again, from Chloe's arrival in Mark's life, the growing list of my financial contributions to his well-being, to the dream dress, the cruel dismissal, and Mark's spineless reaction. Monica listened patiently, making occasional notes, her expression unreadable but attentive. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Then she looked at me directly. "Mrs. Albright," she said, her voice calm but firm, "what has happened to you is appalling. Not just emotionally, but potentially from a legal standpoint regarding the funds for the dress." She explained the complexities of reclaiming a gift, but she also pointed out that a gift given under duress, or significant misrepresentation could, in some circumstances, be challenged. Chloe's subsequent actions, specifically barring you from the wedding after accepting such a substantial sum intended for an event you were naturally expected to attend, could be argued as a form of bad faith. Monica then broadened the conversation. "Beyond the dress, Mrs. Albright, have you provided other significant financial support to your son, or to them as a couple? Are there any joint assets, loans you've co-signed, or are you perhaps named in any way that might affect your own financial security now that this rift has occurred?" This question opened a new avenue of thought. As Monica guided me through a gentle but thorough review of my financial history with Mark, a clearer picture of my leverage began to emerge. Having Monica as an ally, a professional who validated my experience not just as a hurt mother, but as someone who had been wronged in a more tangible sense, was incredibly empowering. The plan forming in my mind began to take on a more concrete, strategic shape. It wasn't just about making them feel bad, it was about protecting myself and reclaiming what was mine, my money, yes, but more importantly, my self-respect. The initial consultation with Monica Holloway had been like a splash of cold, invigorating water to my face. She laid out the stark realities. Reclaiming the money for the dress as a straightforward gift would be difficult. Gifts, once given, are legally just that. However, she'd also planted a seed of an idea that began to flourish in the fertile ground of my newfound resolve. The argument, Monica had explained, her gaze steady, would be that this wasn't simply a gift without expectation. It was intrinsically linked to your participation and celebration of your son's marriage. Her subsequent actions to exclude you, particularly in such a cruel manner, could be viewed as a fundamental breach of the unspoken, but universally understood, contract of familial love and respect that underpins such a significant gesture. We discussed sending a formal letter of demand, not necessarily with the expectation of immediate repayment, but as a clear statement that I was not simply going to absorb this loss and humiliation silently. It was a shot across their bows. But Monica, astute and thorough, didn't stop at the dress. "Mrs. Albright," she'd said, leaning forward slightly, "we need to look at the bigger picture. This incident reveals a concerning pattern of behavior from your son and his fiancée. Are there other areas where your financial well-being is entangled with theirs?" And so began a meticulous review of my life's financial tapestry, a process that was both painful and illuminating. With Monica's guidance, I unearthed old documents, bank statements, and fading memories of financial decisions made over decades. There was the small student loan I'd co-signed for Mark years ago, long since paid off, thankfully. More significantly, there was my will. Mark was, of course, the sole beneficiary of my modest estate, the house, the remaining savings, my few sentimental pieces of jewelry. It was a standard, loving mother's provision. Then there was the house itself. My house. The one I lived in. But in a moment of perhaps naive generosity a few years prior, when Mark was struggling to get on the property ladder and Chloe had just entered the picture, I had briefly, foolishly, considered adding his name to the deeds as a way to give him future security. We'd had initial discussions with a solicitor, though thankfully, the process had never been completed. However, Mark and Chloe knew about this discussion. They knew I'd intended for the house to be his one day. And recently, Chloe had made several comments about how lovely it would be to eventually update my charming but dated kitchen, comments I'd brushed off at the time, but which now took on a more sinister hue. Were they already mentally renovating my home, with me still in it, or perhaps, with me conveniently out of it? The thought sent a chill down my spine. This was the leverage Monica had been seeking. My will, and the future expectation of inheriting my home, were significant. "The plan, Mrs. Albright," Monica said, a new firmness in her voice, "will be twofold. First, we address the matter of the dress funds directly. Second, we make it unequivocally clear that future expectations of financial benefit from you are now under review, shall we say, given their recent conduct." It wasn't about disinheriting Mark out of spite, not entirely. It was about protecting myself from further exploitation and making him understand that my love and support were not unconditional in the face of such profound disrespect. Secrecy and patience became my watchwords. I had to maintain an outward appearance of the grieving, defeated mother. Any hint of my brewing strategy would give them time to prepare, to counter. I continued to limit contact with Mark, offering only brief, non-committal responses if he texted. Chloe, I heard through a reluctant Mark, was in full bridal mode, apparently unconcerned by my absence from her life, probably assuming I was at home weeping into my knitting. I started gathering any small pieces of evidence I could. The withdrawal slip for the dress money, clearly dated. I even wrote down, verbatim, Chloe's cruel words from the salon, dating the entry in my journal. Monica advised me to document any further interactions, however trivial they seemed. Emotionally, I was steeling myself. This was not a path I would have ever chosen, but it was the path they had forced me onto. I visualized the moment they would receive Monica's letter, the moment they would realize their ugly, old, discarded mother had teeth, and a very good lawyer. The dress, that shimmering symbol of their greed and my pain, would be at the heart of it. It was more than just fabric and thread, it was the price of my dignity, and I was determined to make them understand its true cost. The weeks leading up to the wedding crawled by with excruciating slowness, yet simultaneously, the day itself loomed like a fast-approaching storm cloud. Monica and I worked diligently, quietly. The legal documents were drafted, reviewed, and redrafted until they were precise, irrefutable blades. There was the formal letter of demand for the full sum of the dress, citing misrepresentation and severe emotional distress inflicted upon our client, Mrs. Sarah Albright, by Miss Chloe Davison, through the calculated acceptance of significant funds under the false pretense of familial inclusion, followed by a cruel and unwarranted exclusion. Monica had a flair for such language. Alongside this, a second document was prepared, a formal notification of a revision to my last will and testament. It didn't specify the new beneficiary, that was my private business, but it made it crystal clear that Mark's position as sole heir was no longer current. We also drafted a more personal, yet equally firm, letter from me to Mark, to be included with Monica's official correspondence. In it, I didn't rail or accuse. I simply stated facts, my sacrifices, their actions, and my profound disappointment. My outward demeanor towards Mark, on the rare occasions he made contact, was one of quiet resignation. If he asked how I was, I'd sigh and say, "Getting by, dear," which he seemed to interpret as me slowly accepting my fate. Chloe, I gathered, was floating on a cloud of prenuptial bliss and self-importance, occasionally dropping comments to Mark about hoping his mother wasn't going to make a scene, or be difficult. The irony was almost painful. They were so cocooned in their self-absorption, they couldn't imagine me being anything other than a passive, grieving figure. While they were choosing floral arrangements and cake flavors, I was methodically untangling any remaining financial threads that connected us. I reviewed my modest insurance policies, ensuring the beneficiary designations were updated according to my new wishes. I made an appointment with my bank manager, the same kind Sarah, who had looked concerned when I withdrew the dress money, and discussed options for safeguarding my remaining assets, ensuring everything was solely and unequivocally in my name. Each signature, each form filled out, was a small act of liberation, a quiet assertion of my independence and self-worth. The wedding invitations had, of course, been sent out weeks ago. Mine had never arrived. I'd seen a copy of their ostentatious invitation, through a mutual acquaintance of Eleanor's. My name was conspicuously absent even as a courtesy. This petty omission only fueled the cold fire of my resolve. The plan for the delivery of Monica's package was meticulous. It would arrive by special courier on the morning of the wedding, addressed directly to Miss Chloe Davison at the hotel where she would be getting ready. The timing was crucial, late enough to ensure she was there and preparations were underway, but early enough to detonate before she walked down any aisle. I imagined her, surrounded by bridesmaids, hair and makeup half done, suddenly confronted with the stark reality of her actions. There was a quiet strength building within me. The initial maelstrom of hurt and anger had subsided, replaced by a resolute calmness. I was no longer reacting. I was acting, deliberately and thoughtfully. This wasn't about causing a mindless scene, it was about delivering a precisely calibrated consequence. I was moving pieces on a chessboard they hadn't even realized was set up. A few days before the wedding, Mark called. His voice was hesitant. "Mom? Are you really not going to come?" Chloe said, "Well, she said if you apologized properly for being so sensitive, she might reconsider letting you sit at the back." I listened, my heart a cold stone in my chest. Apologize for being sensitive to being called ugly and being barred from my own son's wedding after bankrupting myself for her dress. The delusion was breathtaking. "No, Mark," I said, my voice even and calm. "I have nothing to apologize for. I wish you both the day you deserve." I then hung up before he could respond, the click of the receiver a small, satisfying sound of finality. The eve of the wedding arrived, cloaked in an almost surreal stillness on my end, while I imagined a whirlwind of excited chaos in Mark and Chloe's camp. I pictured Chloe, perhaps having a final dress fitting in her hotel suite, admiring her reflection, blissfully unaware of the reckoning that was barreling towards her. Mark was probably attempting to soothe her nerves, catering to her every whim, oblivious to the fact that his own life was about to take a sharp, unpleasant turn. My final preparations were simple. I reread the copies of the letters Monica had prepared, not for content, but to reaffirm my own conviction. They were factual, firm, and devoid of overt malice, yet their impact, I knew, would be devastating. Eleanor came over that evening. She didn't offer platitudes or try to dissuade me from what was, by any measure, a drastic course of action. She simply sat with me in my quiet living room, her presence a comforting bulwark against any last-minute wavering. We didn't talk much about the impending events of the next day. Instead, she brought over a bottle of my favorite elderflower cordial and a freshly baked seed cake, and we spoke of old times, of our children when they were young and uncomplicated, of dreams we'd once had. It was a gentle evening, a deliberate pocket of peace before the storm I was about to unleash. I imagined Chloe's social media, which I didn't follow but could easily picture, posts about her fairytale wedding, her dream dress, her perfect groom. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. She, who had judged my appearance so harshly, was about to have her own meticulously crafted image shattered. My emotional state was a strange cocktail, a deep, lingering sadness for the relationship with Mark that was now irrevocably broken, but led over it was a steely determination, a sense of profound, albeit grim, clarity. This wasn't an act of spontaneous revenge, it was a carefully considered, long overdue lesson in consequences. I wasn't just Sarah, the discarded mother. I was Sarah, the woman who had finally found her breaking point and her strength. The courier service had been booked by Monica's firm, a reputable company known for its discretion and reliability. The package, containing the letters and legal documents, was scheduled for delivery between 9 o'clock and 9:30 a.m. the following morning, directly to Chloe's bridal suite at the Grand Imperial Hotel. Monica had even arranged for signature confirmation, so there would be no denying its receipt. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor squeezed my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Sarah," she said softly. "For yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that boy of yours will eventually learn something from this." I wasn't so sure about Mark learning anything, not anymore, but I knew I was doing this for me. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, a deep, dreamless sleep. I had done everything I could. The rest was now in motion, a carefully set clockwork mechanism, ticking down to the moment of impact. The ugly duckling, they thought, was about to show she had, if not swan-like grace, then certainly the sharp talons of a creature who would no longer be pecked into submission. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a painfully beautiful day for what I knew would be an ugly unraveling for Chloe and Mark. I imagined the scene at the Grand Imperial Hotel, florists bustling, photographers setting up, bridesmaids chattering with excitement, and Chloe, the radiant bride-to-be, queen of her temporary castle, perhaps sipping champagne, as her hair was styled into an elaborate confection. My own morning was quiet. I made myself a pot of tea and sat by my kitchen window, watching the birds flit about in the garden. There was no triumph in my heart, no gleeful anticipation of their pain, just a profound sense of inevitability, of a necessary and just rebalancing of scales. At precisely 9:17 a.m., my mobile phone, which I'd placed on the table beside me, vibrated. It was a brief text message from Monica, package delivered and signed for by C. Davison. 9:14 a.m., I took a slow sip of my tea. It had begun. In Chloe's bridal suite, the air would have been thick with hairspray and nervous excitement. I could picture her, perhaps laughing at a bridesmaid's joke, when a liveried hotel employee knocked discreetly, presenting a sleek, professional-looking courier envelope addressed to Miss Chloe Davison, annoyed by the interruption, thinking it perhaps a forgotten corsage, or a note from an admirer. She would have torn it open impatiently. Inside, nestled among the crisp legal paper, was my letter to Mark, but the top documents were from Thompson and Associates. The first, the formal demand for the full 5-figure sum of the dress, outlining in cold, legal terms the misrepresentation and emotional distress. Her eyes would have scanned the figures, the accusations. Disbelief, then a flicker of anger. Then, the second document, the notification of the revision to my will. The clear, unambiguous statement that Mark was no longer the sole beneficiary of my estate, that the house she had likely already mentally redecorated was no longer a guaranteed part of their future. Panic would have begun to curdle the excitement. My personal letter to Mark, detailing my pain and his failures, would have been the final, personal twist of the knife, making it clear this wasn't just some anonymous legal threat. I imagined her face paling beneath the expertly applied makeup, her carefully constructed composure cracking. The perfect day was already developing a rather large, ugly flaw. Screams. There would be screams, I felt sure. Chloe wasn't the type to suffer indignity in silence. She would have rounded on Mark, who was probably in an adjacent room, attempting to tie his cravat. He'd be summoned by her shriek, finding her not a radiant bride, but a furious, terrified harpy, waving papers in her hand. Your mother, she would have spat. Look what your ugly, vindictive old mother has done. He would read the documents, the blood draining from his face as the full import of their actions, and my reaction, crashed down upon him. The dress money. The will. The house. His mother, who he had allowed to be discarded like refuse, was not, it turned out, a powerless old woman. She had resources, resolve, and a very competent lawyer. Monica had planned a follow-up call. At around 10 a.m., she would telephone the bridal suite. If Chloe answered, Monica would calmly reiterate the contents of the letters and state my position. If Mark answered, the message would be the same. Mrs. Albright will not be financing her own humiliation, nor will she reward such callous disrespect with her life savings and future legacy. She wishes you well. From a significant distance, the wedding, scheduled for early afternoon, was now teetering on the brink of disaster. Arguments would erupt. Accusations would fly. Chloe's carefully cultivated image of the blissful bride would be shattered in front of her bridesmaids, her makeup artist, anyone within earshot of her meltdown. Would the wedding even go ahead? If it did, it would be under the blackest of clouds, the spectre of my ugliness, and their own far more profound moral failings haunting every moment. I sat in my quiet kitchen, the teacup warm in my hands. There was no joy, but there was a distinct sense of release, as if a heavy weight I'd been carrying for months had finally been set down. The truth was out. The consequences, so richly deserved, were now theirs to manage. The hours that followed the delivery of Monica's package were, for me, filled with a strange sense of detached calm. I knew that across town, at the Grand Imperial Hotel, chaos would be reigning. I didn't need to witness it to know the script. Eleanor called around lunchtime. "Well?" she asked, her voice brimming with curiosity. "Monica called me as prearranged," I told her. The package was delivered. Chloe signed for it herself. Monica made the follow-up call about 45 minutes later. Apparently, she could hear quite a commotion in the background before Mark came to the phone. He sounded. Monica used the word flayed. I pictured Mark, stripped of his composure, confronted with the undeniable repercussions of his weakness and Chloe's cruelty. The wedding, as it turned out, did go ahead, though hours later than scheduled. Eleanor, bless her resourceful soul, had a friend whose niece was a junior staff member at the hotel, and snippets of information trickled through. The bride had apparently had a colossal meltdown. There were raised voices, tears, not the joyful kind, and frantic phone calls. The groom looked like death. Warmed up several guests, overhearing snippets of the drama or noticing the strained atmosphere and delayed proceedings, had begun to whisper. The absence of the groom's mother, initially perhaps a point of mild curiosity for some, now took on a more concrete, scandalous dimension. Later that evening, my phone, which had been silent for hours, rang. It was Mark. His voice was raw, laced with a desperation I hadn't heard since he was a small child afraid of the dark. "Mom, what have you done?" he choked out. "I've merely responded, Mark," I said, my voice even, devoid of the anger that had once consumed me, replaced now by a profound weariness and a sense of finality. "You and Chloe made your choices. You chose to humiliate me, to discard me after I gave you my last savings for her dream. These are simply the consequences of those choices, but the money, the will. Mom, she's devastated. You've ruined our wedding day." "Did I, Mark?" I asked quietly. "Or did Chloe ruin it when she called me too ugly to attend, after pocketing my life savings? Did you ruin it when you stood by and let her? When you valued her aesthetic over your own mother's dignity?" He started to bluster, to plead, to make excuses for Chloe, a pathetic litany of her stress, her perfectionism. I listened for a moment, then cut him off. "Mark, I am no longer interested in Chloe's excuses, or yours. You have the letters. You understand my position. The demand for repayment of the dress fund stands. The changes to my will are permanent. If you wish to discuss how you plan to repay the money I sacrificially gave, you may contact Ms. Holloway. Otherwise, I have nothing further to say to you at this time." I ended the call. There were no more tears to shed for him, only a vast, empty space where my maternal love had once resided. The following days brought a flurry of attempts at contact. Messages from Mark, veering wildly between angry accusations and tearful pleas for forgiveness. Even a stiff, formal email from Chloe's parents, accusing me of unconscionable cruelty, and attempting to extort their daughter, an accusation Monica swiftly and decisively rebutted with a letter of her own, reminding them of the facts. Chloe herself remained silent, probably too proud or too furious to engage directly. The financial impact was clearly hitting home. The demand for the dress money was substantial. The loss of their expected inheritance, the house they had undoubtedly been banking on, was a future suddenly rewritten. They were facing the material cost of their ugliness, and it was a steep price. For me, a profound sense of relief began to settle. The burden of their disrespect, the weight of my silent suffering, had been lifted. I started to sleep through the night again. Food began to taste good. The world outside my window seemed a little brighter. I had taken my power back, not by screaming or crying, but by quiet, deliberate action. The ugly truth about Chloe's character, and Mark's weakness, was now exposed, at least to them and to those in their immediate circle who had witnessed the fallout. Their perfect image was indelibly stained. The weeks turned into months. The initial storm of Mark and Chloe's outrage eventually subsided, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence from their end, punctuated by occasional, carefully worded communications from their solicitor to Monica regarding a potential repayment plan for the dress money. It was clear their marriage had begun under the darkest of clouds, burdened by unexpected debt and the acrid taste of their own making. I heard through Eleanor, whose social tendrils reached surprisingly far, that Chloe was struggling. Her fairy tale had been rudely interrupted by reality. The beautiful dress, if she'd even worn it in the end, was now a symbol of conflict and financial strain. Mark, I imagined, was caught between his demanding wife and the consequences of alienating his mother. Their relationship, built on such shallow foundations of aesthetics and entitlement, was undoubtedly being tested. I, on the other hand, was slowly, purposefully building a new life for myself, a life not defined by my sacrifices for Mark, but by my own needs and desires. I reconnected with old friends like Eleanor, joining her book club and a local gardening group. I started taking long walks, exploring parts of my town I hadn't had time for in years. I even unearthed my old watercolor paints, a passion I'd abandoned when Mark was young and my time was consumed by motherhood and work. My little house, once a place of sorrowful reflection, began to feel like a true sanctuary again, filled with light, burgeoning plants, and the quiet hum of my own contentment. Mark did eventually attempt a more sincere approach. About 6 months after the wedding, he appeared on my doorstep, unannounced. He looked older, tired, the youthful arrogance gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He brought flowers, cheap ones from the supermarket, a far cry from Chloe's expensive tastes. He apologized, truly apologized, for his weakness, for his cruelty by omission, for not defending me. He spoke of Chloe's bitterness, of their constant arguments about money, about me. I listened patiently. "Mark," I said when he'd finished, my voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate your apology. Perhaps, in time, some form of forgiveness will be possible. But trust, Mark, is a delicate thing, like a porcelain teacup. Once shattered, even if you glue the pieces back together, it's never quite the same. The cracks will always be there." I made it clear that while I might, one day, be able to have a civil relationship with him, the old dynamic was gone forever. I would not be his emotional or financial safety net. I would not allow myself to be taken for granted again. He would have to earn back even a modicum of my respect, a process that would take years, if it happened at all. As for Chloe, I had no interest in ever seeing or speaking to her again. Financially, I was secure. The savings I had painstakingly rebuilt, small as they were now entirely my own, to spend or save as I wished. I revised my will again, with Monica's help, leaving my estate to a distant, kind niece who had always shown me quiet affection, and to a charity dedicated to supporting elderly people who had been mistreated or abandoned. It was a decision that brought me a quiet sense of satisfaction. Reflecting on the whole painful saga, I realized I had learned invaluable, albeit harsh, lessons. The importance of self-respect, of setting boundaries even with those you love most dearly. The painful recognition that sometimes, the people you sacrifice everything for are not capable of appreciating it, or worse, will actively exploit your kindness. There was a lingering sadness, of course, for the son I felt I had lost, for the happy family life I had once envisioned. But that sadness was now overshadowed by a profound sense of peace. I had faced the ugliest of betrayals and had not only survived but emerged stronger, more self-aware, and, in a strange way, freer. One sunny afternoon, I took the sum equivalent to what I had spent on Chloe's dress money they were now slowly, grudgingly repaying in small installments, and I booked myself a modest cruise, something I'd secretly dreamed of but never thought I could afford or deserve. As I stood on the deck of that ship, watching the coastline recede, I felt a quiet triumph. I hadn't sought destructive revenge. I had sought justice. I had reclaimed my dignity. I was no longer Sarah, the ugly, underestimated mother. I was Sarah Albright, a woman of substance and strength, navigating her own course, finally at peace, sailing towards her own horizon.